So in 1990, this is a graph of the percentage of obesity. Now this is for adults. They don't quite have this ready for kiddos. And this is all based off of BMI. So there are some limitations behind that because BMI does not take into consideration muscle mass. So someone who has a lot of muscle mass, so for example, The Rock, so Dwayne Johnson, he's technically considered overweight based off of his height to weight ratio, which is BMI. But we all know he's not, but it's the muscle mass that puts him into that category. So we have to kind of take that with a grain of salt. However, it's still a good indicator of where we lie in regards to obesity. Now, when we're looking at BMI, it gets classified as normal weight, and then overweight, and then obese. So this is based off of obesity. So essentially what this is saying is that Texas, for example, has 10 to 14% of their entire population is considered overweight. Let's jump to 1995. 1995, now we have nothing that's white, right? And we have very limited of the lighter blue, and we have a lot more of this kind of royal blue, where about a fourth of the population, well, not quite, 15 to 19% is considered obese. Let's go ahead and jump to 2000. So in 2000, now only Colorado is left with the 10 to 14%, where a huge chunk now is that 1/4, right? So 20 to 24% of that population is considered obese. 2005, we sadly now have 3 states in this red zone here, the dark red with the little dots, where over a third of that population is considered obese. So this is an issue. And then finally, if we look at 2010, startling. So why do you think that these southern states right here have a higher rate of obesity? If you said southern food, you're on the right target. That is a big contributing factor because it's high in calories, high in saturated fat. And interestingly, these states are higher in the low socioeconomic status. So there's more poverty in these states. So there's this dichotomy of poverty, so people who don't have adequate access to food, and obesity. And that's typically because they're relying on what we call energy-dense foods or highly processed foods. So what do you think happened in this 30-year span that we went from having anywhere from about 10 to 15% of the population states being obese to over a third of our nation is over a third obese? Now, this doesn't show any more dates with the same colors. The CDC did actually change it, but it is projected by 2030 that 50% of our population is going to be considered obese. If that doesn't startle you, I don't know what will, but this is where we need to take action in teaching our kids proper nutrition. So how does that average American diet stack up? On the left-hand side, it's a perfect picture of what we're consuming too much of, and on the right-hand side, it's a perfect picture of what we're consuming too little of. In general, Americans consume too much sodium, saturated fat, added sugars, and calories in general. We are always on the go, getting highly processed foods, something that's quick and convenient. And on the right, we are lacking fruits, vegetables, and whole grains. Specifically, if we look at 2 nutrients, fiber, which is found in fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts, and seeds, significantly lacks in the American diet. It's recommended that we have 5 servings of fruits and vegetables per day. The average American adult is only consuming about 3/4 of a cup. So we're significantly under that fiber intake. Another number here is that the recommendation for fiber intake is anywhere from 25 to 38 grams per day for adults, and the average adult is only consuming 12 grams of fiber per day. This is when we want to shift our focus onto more nutrient-dense foods. Now, calcium is one of those minerals that we've been having problems with in America, and it continues to be on the rise, mostly due to the trend of not consuming cow's products or cow's milk or cheese and so forth. A lot of the dairy alternatives some of them are not fortified, so that means you're missing out on a good source of calcium. So if you're someone who doesn't drink or eat any type of cow products, like cheese or dairy, it is important for you to make sure that your alternatives have calcium fortification in it. So let's get into the basics of some essential nutrients. Here we have a plate of food. On this plate of food, you'll find the 6 essential nutrients. The 6 essential nutrients are lipids, water, minerals, proteins, carbohydrates, and vitamins. Now we can determine which are considered macronutrients and which are considered micronutrients by a few concepts. So go ahead and try to guess, which do you think are considered your macronutrients and which do you think are considered your micronutrients? If you guessed lipids, carbohydrates, and protein are your macronutrients, you're correct. Sometimes people get confused and think that water is considered a macronutrient because it is the most essential nutrient. However, when we look at the chemical structure of water, it's a very small molecule. It's H2O. So basically 3 pieces are coming together to form water. So that makes it a micronutrient. Micronutrients mean that chemically they're very small. Micro means small. So water, minerals, and vitamin are all considered micronutrients based off of those chemical structures. Whereas lipids, also known as fat, carbohydrates, and protein are long chains of molecules, making them very large molecules, hence the name macro. Another reason that lipids, carbohydrates, and proteins are considered macronutrients is because they provide energy, where water, minerals, and vitamins do not. What do I mean by energy? What I mean by energy is calories. So the way our body gets energy and it makes us move, helps our brain function, helps our heart pump blood, is through energy. Carbohydrates, protein, and lipids all provide a certain amount of calories per gram. Carbohydrates and protein share a commonality of 4 calories per gram. For example, if you had a carbohydrate, so like a slice of bread, typically is anywhere from 10 to 20 grams of carbohydrates. So let's just go with the 10 grams to make math a little bit easy. So if you had 10 grams of a carbohydrate, then that would be approximately 40 calories. Lipids have twice as much calories per gram, or basically for the same volume size as carbs and protein. Fat provides 9 calories per gram. So sadly, this is why the serving size on peanut butter is so small. Now, alcohol is not considered a macronutrient. However, it is important to understand that alcohol still has calories. A traditional calorie per gram for alcohol is 7 calories. So let's look at the main functions of carbs, protein, and fat, and food sources. We're going to start with carbohydrates because carbohydrates should be the bulk of everyone's diet. It's the largest staple in most diets around the world, and here in the United States, it's recommended for your total calories to have anywhere from 45 to 65% of your total calories. This is a good recommendation across the board. However, some countries don't have access to higher protein foods or higher fat foods. The primary function of carbohydrates is an energy source. Carbohydrates break down into glucose, and glucose is just a fancy word for sugar. So sugar is really what's producing energy inside of our bodies. We can classify carbohydrates as simple and complex. Now, society will classify your simple carbs as, quote, the bad carbs, and your complex carbs as, quote, the good carbs. However, this language is not appropriate to use because anytime we put a moral value on food, then we feel good or bad when we eat that said good or bad food. So when we look at the simple carbohydrates, a really easy way to distinguish is that it lacks fiber. So what that means is we're looking at white rice, sugary cereals, our sweets, our cookies, cakes, donuts, and then our sugary beverages. These are all considered simple carbohydrates based on their chemical structure and then the fact that it doesn't have fiber in it. Our complex carbohydrates are things like your fruits, your vegetables, and your whole grains. And then your starches, so like your whole wheat bread, your whole wheat pasta, or your brown rice, quinoa, oatmeal, even beans are considered a complex carbohydrate. So think about all your plant-based foods. Plant-based foods are going to be complex carbohydrates because they are loaded with fiber and good healthy nutrients. So we want to shift our focus onto consuming more complex carbohydrates and limit the amount of simple carbohydrates that we consume in our diets. I like to share this graph with you because this is an excellent way to show you the difference nutritionally between whole grains and white grains. On the left-hand side is what would represent brown rice or whole wheat bread or whole wheat pasta. On the right-hand side is what would represent white bread, white rice, white pasta. Now the commonality here is your endosperm. So this endosperm is the middle layer of the wheat kernel that provides the carbohydrates and protein. Now, during the processing of making that white bread, they're going to remove the bran, which is the outer layer, which is full of fiber and B vitamins. They're also going to remove this germ, which has healthy vitamin E and also our healthy fats, to get this endosperm remaining. Now, the reason they want that is for the texture. So if you've ever compared white bread and whole wheat bread, the white bread has a very refined texture, where the whole grain is nutty, it's firmer, and that's because it's loaded with our fiber and loaded with our healthy fats. So here, it's important to make at least half your grains whole, if not 100% of them. Next, we're going to look at protein. Our society is completely obsessed with protein. We have protein bars, protein shakes, protein cookies, and even protein Cheerios. But it's important to note that we're really good at utilizing the proteins found within our body, and we really only need anywhere from 10 to 35% of our total calories coming from protein. Now, what's this dependent on? It's largely dependent on activity levels, just the way carbohydrates are, which I didn't mention earlier. So you're going to want to go on the higher end if you're more active, versus if you're more sedentary, you go on the lower end. There are some people who require low protein diets, and then there's some people who require a higher protein diet. It really becomes individualized. However, protein is the least amount of macronutrient that we actually need in our diets, which is a common misconception in our culture. The primary functions of protein within the body, pretty easy to identify for most, is that it has to do with our muscle. So people who are working out in the gym, they want to eat a lot of protein because they want to try to increase their muscle mass. However, it's important to note that if they are not consuming adequate calories, you will never gain muscle mass. Protein also plays a role in creating our hormones, so things like insulin or estrogen, and creating our enzymes, so things like lactase that help break down the lactose in cow's milk. The way we classify proteins is considered complete or incomplete. The complete proteins are all your animal-based proteins, and also soy. Soy is an outlier. And with that, it means that they contain all 9 essential amino acids. I'll get to that in a bit. The incomplete proteins are your plant-based sources. So things like your nuts or your grains, they're going to have protein in it, but it is considered an incomplete protein because it lacks one or more amino acid that's essential. So what do I mean by that? Here's a huge chart of the 20 amino acids that are found in our foods. So protein gets broken down into individual amino acids. We have 20 total. 9 of them are essential. So this pink box over here to the left are your 9 essential amino acids. What that means is that you must consume essential amino acids in your diet in order to have them in your body. Your body will not make these essential amino acids. Therefore, people who are vegan and vegetarian run the risk at becoming deficient in essential amino acids because they're consuming mostly incomplete proteins, which means that they're missing one or more of these essential amino acids. But don't worry, by combining certain foods, they can complement one another and become a complete protein. What do I mean by this? Well, beans and rice make a complete protein. Beans are missing one amino acid that the rice has, and the rice is missing the amino acid that the beans have. Therefore, when you put them together, it becomes a complete protein. The other two, the yellow and the green, are your non-essential amino acids. So this means that your body can actually make them, so therefore you don't have to eat them in your diet. The yellow one here, they can become essential, only under severe cases. So things like if a burn patient is running through all of their trying to make new skin, they can become essential for them. Our last macronutrient is fat. Fat is the primary energy source for resting muscles, and even right now, as you sit and listen to this, you're burning fat. Fat should be anywhere from 20 to 35% of our total calories. The way we look at fat within our food systems is either saturated or unsaturated. So saturated fats are in things like your animal-based products. There's one outlier, which is actually coconut oil. We want to limit the amount of saturated fat in our diet, and we want to focus on consuming more unsaturated fat. Unsaturated fat is what gives us all those really good health benefits. So things like avocado, nuts, seeds, oils, salmon are all going to be great sources of unsaturated fat. The Mediterranean diet is actually 50% unsaturated fat, and it has cardioprotective factors. So what that means is that it has gotten the stamp of approval from research saying that if you follow a Mediterranean diet, it will reduce your risk of getting cardiovascular disease, i.e. heart disease. So when we're looking at this 20 to 35% of our total calories, we want to shift our focus onto consuming more unsaturated fat. The main functions of fat in our bodies is to protect our vital organs. They help absorb our fat-soluble vitamins, which are vitamin A, D, E, and K, and they also form our cell membranes. We have trillions of cells in our body, and the cell membrane plays an important role on keeping things inside the cell that need to be inside and things outside the cell that need to be outside. Here is a great chart that actually shows the representation of fats. So if we look at the different types of dietary fat, so if I were to look at olive oil, for example, it has both saturated fat and unsaturated. So your unsaturated is your blue, your orange, and your yellow here. However, we would classify olive oil as unsaturated fatty acid because that is what is most dominant. Whereas butter, for example, is 68% saturated fat. Therefore, we would classify butter as a saturated fat. Now, I like to point this out because there's a big misconception around saturated fat. People think that coconut oil is super healthy for you. However, it's important to note that it is loaded with saturated fat. So there's 91% of coconut oil is saturated, compared to butter is only 68%. Why do I point this out? Well, the Dietary Guidelines of 2015-2020 recommend that no more than 10% of our total fat comes from saturated. So this is important to reduce the amount of saturated fat that we're consuming. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about vitamins and minerals because one of your first assignments is actually going to be creating a page on a particular vitamin and mineral, and then you're going to go in and read your peers. So we're not going to spend that time talking about the different functions within the vitamins and minerals. However, I do want to talk about how do we make sure that we're getting all these healthy nutrients within our bodies. The government came out with Choose MyPlate. I believe it was in 2012 is when it got approved, and then we started seeing it a couple years later. And with that, this is a good visual tool that shows you what your plate should look like. So they recommend that half of your plate is fruits and vegetables, a quarter of it is grain, a quarter of it is protein-rich foods, and then you have some type of dairy component. Now this could be a dairy substitute, however, they're really just looking for a high calcium food here. MyPlate replaced MyPyramid. So you might be familiar with MyPyramid. There's another one where the bottom part would be the grains and then so forth. So MyPyramid is the old version of MyPlate. They recognized it was a little confusing for the average person to understand how to consume these different food groups, so they simplified it. So I want to know, what are the main differences when you compare MyPlate and MyPyramid? Which do you prefer? Why? So the MyPlate is based off the Dietary Guidelines of 2015-2020. Michelle Obama actually did some great work for nutrition policy to promote healthy eating, to prevent overnutrition, so basically in excess, and undernutrition, so being able to address people who are not getting adequate nutrition. The Dietary Guidelines of 2015-2020 recommend that you consume a healthy diet throughout the lifespan. So instead of waiting until you're an old person and you have a disease and then start eating healthy, rather start eating healthy from even when the baby is in the womb. The other update, and these get updated every 5 years, was to reduce saturated fat and added sugars to less than 10% of your total calories. We'll talk a lot more about added sugars when we look at the food label. Another recommendation is to increase nutrient-dense foods. This is a very broad recommendation and just encouraging more whole foods. So instead of eating highly processed foods, eat your whole grains, your fruits, your vegetables, things that have a lot of nutrients in them. And then lastly, it is going to take a village to help turn around our society. So everyone plays a role. So whether you're a school teacher, whether you're in government policy, whether you are a dietitian, or whether you're a physician, we all play some type of role in promoting a healthy society through nutrition. So this concludes the first video for online this week, and I want to leave you with this quote. Nutrition is an investment, not instant gratification. We live in a society where people are quick to take pills, potions, shakes, and whatever cure-all in order to get the body that they want or become healthy. But in fact, it's really simple. Move more and eat more plant-based foods.